Unsurprisingly, the biggest legal trend or issue that we were dealing with in 2021 was COVID. So we act for a number of regulatory bodies that have various enforcement functions in the area, and they quite often needed advice very quickly because the COVID situation was changing so fast on their powers of enforcement and inspection and things like that. So lots of advice in that area. But interestingly, also a lot of advice given to bodies which were subject to emergency COVID legislation, very anxious to know how to bring themselves into compliance with it quickly, because of course, breach of that legislation was a criminal offence, and no organisation wanted to find themselves the subject of a criminal prosecution arising out of a breach of the COVID legislation. So again, lots of very fast turnaround advice on compliance with legislation in the COVID field. So in the upcoming year, of course, we all hope that COVID is going to recede and is going to be less of an issue. I think the obvious trend for 2022, of course, will be climate issues. And we expect to do a reasonable amount of work in that area. Again, we act for some regulatory bodies that have very significant functions and roles to play in helping Ireland reach its climate action targets. And we're looking forward to being involved in supporting those clients in that work. But there's also a couple of areas that I'm personally very interested in that I think are going to develop over 2022. The first of those is the reform of gambling legislation in Ireland. As you may know, our licensing of gambling rules are pretty old and outdated at this stage. So there's new legislation being drafted at the moment to bring those up to date and to put in place a gambling regulator. So I think that legislation is going to have very important and far-reaching consequences for many organisations. The second area, which is also very interesting, but quite a different area, is bringing forward legislation to deal with safeguarding of vulnerable and at-risk adults in the health sector. So this is an area where there's very little regulation at the moment, and it's an area that has been really focused on recently by Safeguarding Ireland. And there is legislation being drafted at the moment to address this area. And again, that legislation, if and when it's implemented, will have very far-reaching consequences for lots of healthcare organisations. So I think it's one that we will be watching the development of with great interest.